Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Offside, our dedicated Barcelona channel, where we'll do a bit of football, a bit of Barca, and everything in between. Barca, as it always happens, is a place where drama doesn't sleep. It's a place where things keep happening on a daily basis. Every minute, there's something happening at Barca.
The latest news of Xavi leaving may not be so much of drama as something that has happened, and people may have points of view on whether it was right or wrong or what have you. But for today, we thought that at the halfway point of the season, we would start to analyze some of our key players and how they have progressed or regressed. The person that we have chosen is Ronald Araujo. He has been mostly the linchpin of the defense for the last couple of years, the fundamental pillar around whom the Barcelona defense is built. Of course, last year we had that really strong defensive setup, which helped us win La Liga. This season, even though the players have remained the same, the performance hasn't. And we started to think about whether we could analyze some of the reasons.
Yeah, so the way I think this should be done or could be done is we'll try and separate this into both tactical and statistical analysis to give context to each one of those, right? Because the player, as you rightly pointed out, Dev, has changed over the years. Some things are for good, some things might not be as good anymore, or maybe some things have stagnated due to certain circumstances around the club. So this is one of the things that is very important to note is that defense is very much a collective thing. So if one player struggles, it might be indicative of his personal things. Of course, it can be individual, always is, but there also might be things behind the scenes in terms of the collective, in terms of the whole environment, relationships that don't necessarily work that well. But with all that being said, I will transfer us to the tactics board in a second, and we can look at a couple of situations that I would like to analyze further with you guys. So the way I envisioned this is I want to divide this part of the analysis, the tactical analysis, into two separate things. So the first two situations that we'll see here will showcase Araujo's strengths. But then once we've done that, we'll focus on Araujo's weaknesses. So we'll have two situations for each of these scenarios, right? So before I go into it, if you were put on the spot and you had to list some of Araujo's biggest strengths, what would you say they are as of right now?
If I look at the evolution of the player, when Araujo came, I think his core defensive ability stood out massively, corresponding to his ball playing ability or his ball progression ability. As of today, I would say his ability to read the game is much better. He has improved on that based on decision making, based on timing, and his ability to progress the ball, especially under Xavi. He can read the game, he can read a dribbler or a marker, and can delay the time of interception by just covering. Apart from that, obviously, there is his aerial prowess, but I think there's still some way to go for him to become that real defensive stalwart like a Piqué used to be in his heydays, to hold that high line and marshal it.
Exactly. That's a good point. That just being able to marshal a backline, being the de facto leader of the backline, saying, okay, this needs to be done. This is how we do this. This is how we stay compact at all times. This is something that Araujo definitely has in him because he has that captain or leadership material. But I would say that for the purposes of this particular scene, which you have a game against Villarreal, which we know how it ended, but there were situations which Araujo was really good against Villarreal, but there were also shaky moments that we'll have to address later on. I would say on the face of it, Araujo's physical components or aspects are off the charts. This is what he really excels at. So when he has someone running at him, 1 versus 1, Araujo is there to win most of those duels. So he's a duel winning machine. I think that still holds true largely to a large extent. And you also mentioned that he recognizes when to delay actions, when to predict actions. And that's very crucial because he does understand where the future problem lies. So he looks at the space and he sees, okay, this is where the attack will eventually come to, right? It might not be there at the moment, but this is where the opposition is heading towards, and I need to be there to stop it. In this particular instance, I want to show you Araujo's aerial prowess, which you mentioned, his dueling, and then also his physical attributes, which can help him prevent both present and future instances. So Barca were on the attack in this instance, but Villarreal, they lose the ball, and Villarreal are in possession at the moment. And the first instinct they have is to play long to Sorloth because he can win those duels. He can collect the first ball and maybe set up the second ball as well. But what ends up happening is the ball goes there, but Araujo is attentive to the situation. He is on Sorloth immediately. He sprints towards him. He closes the gap very quickly, which he normally does, and he wins the aerial duel against Sorloth, which is impressive in its own right, which kind of highlights the first thing I want to say, which is the physical confrontation, even with someone who is, let's say, equal or close to him in that category as well. But to win the first ball here, the ball falls back here, but then Villarreal collect the second ball and they immediately break again. So what happens next is this player right here sends the ball into the space behind Barcelona's back line, which means that Araujo now has found himself in a race and he needs to beat his marker, beat his man to get to the ball first. And I think this is one of the key aspects of his defensive profile. In these situations where you have a transitional moment where Barca are generally very shaky at, right? You have Araujo who will use his physical aspects, but also his recognition of space and how to move, when to move to get to the ball first, because the ball moves very fast and has a slight advantage at first. But Araujo manages to close down the gap. He slides down, he clears the ball, and Barca prevent a very dangerous situation from unfolding. So I think this, on the face of it, is what Araujo is best at. So he will win the initial duels, physical battles, aerial, on the ground, doesn't really matter. He will win those. But even if you put him in a slightly disadvantageous situation where he has to make up for, I don't know, a yard or two of disadvantage in space, in distance rather, he will do that and he will manage to clear the situation nonetheless. Now we'll move to the second situation, which is against Athletic Club. And once again, we're focusing on Araujo's strengths here. So in this particular instance, again, we have somewhat of a transitional situation where Athletic Club are attacking with numbers and they have the dynamic advantage of Barcelona, which means that they are already on the move. They're attacking the space and Barca have to react quickly. Now, this player right here is actually Nico Williams, and he's about to receive the ball in a very advantageous situation. Now, the thing with Araujo is he has to make a decision right there. He has to make a decision whether to step up and immediately close down Nico, or does he defend the future space that is going to be exploited by Athletic Club. So this is when I said that he's good at predicting where the attack is going to go and how it's going to develop, and then reacting to it in an appropriate way before rushing things, without forcing things unnecessarily. So the ball quickly goes into space right there. And what Nico does well, he exploits space really well, and he's very quick, very dynamic, and he will get there very quickly. But before this happens, Araujo starts to backtrack a little bit. He starts to go back into space, and he starts to go towards the position where the ball will end up. So Araujo is already here when Nico receives the ball in space, and he can battle one against one in a slightly wider positioning, but he's there in time. I can say ahead of time, because he knows where the play is going to develop into. And then we have a very classic 1-versus-1 situation where he has to use his dueling prowess, his challenging prowess, his physical attributes, and his intelligence to stop a player who is very dangerous in 1-versus-1 situations. And he does it really well. Now, the play moves into the box. Barca eventually get numbers. Athletic Club get numbers. But the thing is, Araujo against Nico ends up being a battle won by the Barcelona defender, which is something that not many would do in a situation against Nico Williams himself. So I think this is one of the aspects that tends to be overlooked, is stopping the situations from becoming too dangerous ahead of time, right? So he is there to predict what's going to happen and then stop it in its roots before it develops into something that cannot be controlled or contained at that point in time.
I think this has been used a lot by Xavi, specifically in most of the Clásicos that we have faced, to just thwart the threat of Vini. And he's done this often against Vini, because Vini is an excellent dribbler of the ball with pace. So when he goes forward, you will see Araujo a lot of times backtracking or reading the situation of where Vini might want to dribble and pass, and then delaying the tackle or the interception to that moment. And that often has made him successful. Of course, sometimes he wins, sometimes he loses. But this ability of his is good. It's one of the things that makes him stand out. I think Maldini was probably the best exponent of something like this. We're not talking about Maldini here, but he definitely has that ability to understand, intercept, and think about where the game might go instead of where the game is.
Exactly. This is very important against these kind of wingers or play attackers like Nico Williams, like Vinicius, because you can, if you're put into these situations a lot. So if he has to defend Vinny Jr., let's say in 10 challenges a game, right? And that's a lot, right? And if he wins 9 of them and then Vinny wins 1, that can still cost you a goal. But if you can prevent that situation from happening in the first place, you obviously give yourself a better chance of avoiding a goal, avoiding a mistake, avoiding a dangerous situation in the first place. So I think this is a crucial aspect of any defender who has elite aspirations. Now we'll move to the second part of this tactical analysis, which will focus more on Araujo's weaknesses. Now, over the years, we know that there have been certain things about his profile that have been lacking and still might be lacking. But looking at his complete player overview, what would you, Dev, say are still the issues of Araujo's profile? Or better yet, have you noticed anything that's an issue right now that's not been an issue perhaps in the past as well?
There's no perfect answer to this, depending on how you look into it, because there are lots of situations. But I think lapses in concentration. I think Araujo, while he's great, but he's young, right? He does suffer from lapses in concentration from time to time, which does lead to a lot of attacks that might have been prevented, especially this season, and to some part, even latter parts of last season, right? Now, we'll come to why it may have become like that, because in his first 2 seasons, it was really impeccable. His core defensive ability, right, was much better than what we have seen over the next 2 seasons that he had been in FC Barcelona. The second thing is, if you're a leader of a defense, your ability to manage a box melee, right, when you have the opponent coming in, they're floating in cross after cross, and you have 10 players inside the box trying to score a goal somehow, I have not found Araujo taking that leadership to manage that situation. And this has happened plenty of times this month, Barcelona, and this year overall, like this season when I'm talking about it, right? So you'll often see that we have this defensive situation where we have 7 Barcelona players inside the box, right? 2 opponents, and we still concede. Because nobody has an idea on what to cover, whom to cover, what to look at, and just that peace and calm and state of mind, along with that reading of that situation with a firm hand and giving that direction that, okay, this is how we're going to manage that situation. He's reactive in that situation. So he becomes an isolated person within the whole, whereby either he has to take it out himself, which is not always possible because you cannot cover everything in a situation like that where anything can happen. The next moment you have 20 people scrambling after a ball, right? So I think there I find there's a lot for him to improve, especially in those situations when we are faced with a threat of that kind. And finally, for Barca to play the high line, where he has improved massively is his ball carrying and ball progression, thanks to Xavi. So that's a definite improvement that we have seen. But for our high line, the way you marshal that high line, the way you dictate the tempo, the way you dictate the passes, and the way you work with the defensive midfielder to support the midfield and also manage attacks in transition, I think Araujo has ways to go on that.
And that's very interesting because the fact that you mentioned that sometimes he is the cause of those errors, that's a very big point, because what will often happen, or at least this season that has often happened, is Araujo trying something on the ball, Araujo trying to do something that he might not be comfortable with, then creating that dangerous situation in the first place, and then putting out the fire through his physicality, through his great defensive prowess. So basically, he's cleaning up his own mess, in a sense, which it's a bit unfair because he is a great defender, but at the same time, if he's the one causing those situations in the first place, that needs to be addressed as well. This scenario right here against the Athletic Club once more, I would like to focus on his positional awareness or those lapses in concentration that you mentioned, which do seem to have to be happening a bit more often, at least this season compared to the rest of the seasons that we've seen him play. So Athletic Club are here on the attack on the right side of the pitch, and they do have a winger trying to whip across into the box. Araujo is there. Barca do have decent numbers compared to Athletic Club. They should be able to manage this. They do not concede here, which is a big point, but at the same time, they do concede a big chance nonetheless. Araujo is checking back. He's putting the bodies in the box. So he's trying to defend the space, but he is not aware of the runner behind him. Doesn't check his shoulder. He doesn't track his runner properly, or maybe he tracks it, but he loses him over a shorter distance in the pitch. And what ends up happening is this cross comes in. It's a really good cross that goes in. Araujo is not scanning his shoulder. He's not checking his blind spot. And then this runner over here gets onto the ball first. And what Athletic Club have from this situation is a very good situation, a very good attempt at goal that just goes wide and misses the target. But again, Araujo could have and maybe should have been first to that ball had he checked his shoulder, had he tracked his runner properly, had he not had that lapse of concentration possibly that we keep mentioning here. Maybe Barcelona could have avoided the situation in the first place, but they didn't, and they were possibly a bit lucky not to concede.
The same reading the game that I talked about when Araujo comes on a one-on-one situation where he's very good in interpreting where it can go, he cannot apply that when the situation has 5 people for some reason or the other, right? And it's not just Araujo, it's the whole of the Barcelona defense, but we're talking about Araujo today. And I think that's a problem.
Finally, we have the last example, which showcases one of Araujo's weaknesses for sure, but I wanted to use this situation to explain a larger problem, which is the problem with the collective, right? So as I mentioned or alluded to earlier, sometimes these individual lapses or individual slumps or declines or stagnations can be a part of a bigger, much deeper problem, which goes back to the collective, right? Araujo is often tasked to do things that he maybe should not be doing. He's maybe forced into situations that he should not be forced into. And sometimes because of the lapse or the struggle of the collective, the individual within that collective also looks a bit shakier than he might normally be, right? Which is the case with Araujo as well. This is a game against Real Betis. We know how that ended, but it's also, despite a relatively good performance, we did see a couple of shaky aspects of this Barcelona. And the thing with those shaky moments is that they are a part of a recurring problem, right? So with that in mind, Dev, just looking at the screen right there, what would you say is one of the issues that this collective defensive structure has? And how would you see this situation unfolding? Obviously, you don't know which situation it exactly is, but looking at the screen, what would you say happens next?
I think lack of defensive compactness. I think we have the 4 people in the defensive line. I think Xavi did improve that. You could see lines of 4 retreating or coming forward, but the lack of a defensive midfielder, plus our general weakness in our midfield to compensate for that, especially after Gavi's injury this season, you can see that the midfield can be bypassed pretty easily. And if you're holding a high line, then you are chasing the game at that moment, right? The midfield has not been able to provide the defense with the support that was needed, right? For majority of the season. We'll not go into blaming individual people because, as you said, it's collective. It's a collective issue, which I think Xavi failed to mitigate. He probably tried doing that last season with his 4-box midfield, but this season we suffered for that. And you can see while there are lines of 4 defenders in the defense, there's a lot of space in that zone of 14 area where one can easily move into. And there's a lot of ball watching that we do when we are faced on the offensive, when we are facing a transition and so on. I would say lack of defensive compactness as an overall collective, which has been a problem throughout the season. The lack of a actual defensive midfielder who can work in tandem between the defense and the midfield to give that defensive solidity, and the abject failure of our midfield in providing the defense with any kind of coverage when facing a transition.
Yes, and I think the first point that you made with the compactness or the lack thereof is the critical thing here, because that's what we keep coming back to, right? If a team is not compact, regardless of any of your identities or even your philosophies, right? If you want to defend in a low block, that's fine. If you want to defend in a high block, high press, that's fine. But the key is to always be compact no matter what you do, because a unit that's compact is, of course, much more successful in both attacking and defending. Defending in particular, because if you make the pitch smaller, it's easier to defend that pitch. You can see that Barcelona, there's a huge distance between the first line to the back line and the second line, which is the midfield line. And this is where the danger happens, where it is born from, right? This player right here can receive the ball fairly easily with a simple pass through here, which should not be happening. And this forces Araujo to step up. This is nothing unusual. Center backs are often forced, or there's a need for them to jump out occasionally at least and combat these people between the lines. But the problem is there's so much space there, and Araujo has to cover so much space in a big distance that it becomes very dangerous. What ends up happening is that he starts chasing ghosts, as people say nowadays. So this player receives the ball, he goes deeper, and Araujo follows him all the way into the Betis half, which again creates the space right there and forces Araujo, who is one of our main defenders, the best defenders that we have. It moves him away from the zones that he's meant to protect. So the most valuable zones to protect. He's no longer there, and there's a lot of space there instead of a defender who's the core of your defensive line. So what the Betis ended up doing is they end up having this space and exploiting this space. The ball goes back here, and it goes quickly into space. This guy runs here. It doesn't end up in a goal, lucky for Barcelona, but it ends up in a very dangerous situation that easily could have been more than just a fright.
We wanted to look at it in two views. One was obviously what happens in game state and how do the tactics of the team or the collective or the individual affect the overall outcome of a situation. And then on the other side, we wanted to look at the data across 3 or 4 seasons to understand what the evolution of that player has been, to the extent that data can tell that story, and to provide it with some sort of context. All right. So what I did was look at his player profile radar chart or polar chart, whatever you want to call it, over the last 4 seasons. On the left-hand side, you have 2021, and look at some specific things like XG blocked, aerial win percentage, intercepts, and also his progressive passes and his threat from progressive passes. Now let's come to 2022, and you can immediately see the drop in XG blocked. Aerial remains more or less the same, correct? But look at the improvement in progressive passing, plus the threat from those passes that have been generated. And it's pretty interesting to see how much a coach or a philosophy of play or the need to adjust to a particular team can change the way a player plays. And you can see the evolution continue. His intercepts are falling. His XG block is lower. His progression has improved. His passing has improved. His pass percentage has improved. His winning of tackles has improved, which means his reading of the game, where often you probably don't need to tackle or intercept if you can read better, if you can understand where the attack is going to come from. Especially in one-on-one situations, I think he's become very good at that, and you can see it in the data. And we have all talked about this improvement on the ball, especially after Xavi came in. It has been markedly different from what it was. And then look at 2023 and 2024. That's a sea change in the overall profile of a player. His ability to adapt and make this happen, commendable. But then probably this is also the reason that if you take on so many other responsibilities, some of your core defensive ones will shrink, which is what we talked about, the stagnation or some of the errors that have crept in. It's maybe the errors have crept in because of the changes that he tried to bring into his game.
The thing that stands out the most to me, as you rightly pointed out, is the evolution of Araujo, the player. I think when he came in, we knew what he was, right? We knew he was a dual monster. We knew that he was a proper natural defender who had clear strengths and clear weaknesses. But then he's also a player who's stepping up to a much, much higher level of play. And he plays for a club that has a very specific way of playing. And Barca required not just their center backs, every player to have a certain technical foundation, technical quality. No matter what position or role you play, you have to be able to contribute and put some value into the buildup, into the creation of attacks, and into basically every phase of the game in possession of the ball, right? So I think seeing how he has managed to adapt, even if his passing and on the ball ability still leaves some room for improvement, we have to say that. Just the fact that he has managed to improve so much is a testament to both his talent and his adaptability. I think that's a very big point to consider. But also looking at these charts, especially the one from 22-23, which was Barca's very successful defensive season, we see that the need for Araujo to be this defensive monster is actually not as big as it is right now when Barca are suffering defensively. And that's because you didn't need Araujo to be the only big focal defensive point. You didn't need Araujo to be this duel monster in every single game and win every single tackle, because the collective was much more stable and the responsibility was much more even across that backline. You had Ter Stegen, who's had clutch games. You had Koundé, who was very good. Araujo was very good. You had all these players contributing to this defensive stability. And even though it was individuals shining, it was more than just one player shining, which is immediately a much, much better way to operate, much more sustainable way to operate. And that's why I think the difference between these graphs is so drastic in terms of aerials and tackles won.
Football is a game of 11 people, and I think just goes always to show that for a team to perform and for an individual to perform, how much the collective is important for that person's individual success. If you see tackles per 90, that has actually gone down over the seasons if you look at it from a trend perspective. But if you look at tackles won per 90, it has actually improved, which means the anticipation of the game has improved. And that dual monster avatar that you just talked about does not need to come out that often, right? So he tackles less. Now, is that the right thing or wrong thing? That depends on the context of the game at that time. But definitely, he's using more of his intelligence, game reading, and his timing of doing that, which means that he's improving in the win percentage of that. His tackles made in the defensive third going down, but tackles that have been made in the middle third are going up. Two reasons. One is because when we play a high line, by the time you cross the high line, there's no time to put a defensive tackle anymore. And the second is because he's tried to take the game to the opposition a little bit away from the box. So he's trying to read the game or make that tackle before it reaches the box. And that's a marked change, because if you look into the amount we have conceded, like 19 goals this month, I think there's a balance that needs to be there. But I think this has also been affected with the sheer lack of an actual defensive midfielder and our midfield's inability to give the defense the cover that is required.
I think this is very interesting because in the tactical part of this video, we already talked about this, him making the tackles in the middle third, which is often a consequence also of a leaky structure because there's no one to defend that area between the lines. And Araujo is forced out of the back line into the middle third to cover and put out those flames that should not be put out by him exclusively, but they are often because the whole structure is missing, the certain profiles are missing in certain areas of the pitch. And I think that you can see that. And if we move Araujo away from this crucial defensive third where he needs to protect the most valuable zones in a defensive phase, and he's not there to do that, then that's a big problem. And we also spoke about the value of tackles themselves. He's very consistent in making those tackles and winning those tackles, but at the same time, how valuable is that when it comes to the big picture? Because you can win 20 tackles, and then the 21st tackle that you don't win can result in a goal. Or maybe you're perfect the whole game, but then your teammate on the other side messes up one tackle and you still concede a goal. So you can be a perfect tackler of the ball. You can have 100% win rate on tackles every single game, and you can still concede 3 or 4 goals in each of those games, and it doesn't make a difference. I feel like the things that he does really well are valuable to an extent, but they have a certain ceiling of value that is not as high, if you get what I mean. In that sense, a goalkeeper, a good shot stopper, for example, is more valuable than a good tackler, but it's just, I'm not saying that Araujo is not valuable at all, but the things that he does really well at the moment, they have a cap on them, right? They have a cap on them, and that's why Barca have a defensive monster in their ranks and are still conceding many goals, because there's a limit to how much he can provide value with solely that and how much he can compensate for a more of a collective issue, a deeper issue of the team.
I agree. So let's move to the next set. And I've kept this format the same, opposing trends. Now we look into challenges in percentage per 90 and the challenges lost per 90. So his challenges that he's making, the number of challenges has come down, right? Now, that can be a good or a bad thing. It can be good if he's reading the game incredibly well, which means he's become a better defender. He doesn't need to challenge, he improved. Because if you look into 2021, that's 100. You can't go better than that, right? And if you look into 2021, challenges lost, it's a 0, which means he won every single one of them. So you take that person, and then you see his challenges are going down over the season. And yes, he is reading the game better. There's no question about that. For sure he is. But look at the number of losses per 90. That's definitely not a very optimum situation if you are the defensive leader of the team. And I'm not blaming Araujo or picking on him. I think a lot of it has to do with the shaky structure of the team or just the way Barca have played the last couple of seasons and so on. Probably there's also an aspect of coaching and guidance in terms of what do you want that player to be? Do you play to his strengths? Do you want him to become completely something different? And what actually is beneficial for him and the team? So I'll keep going. Tackles and interceptions per 90 have actually gone down, while errors leading to goal-bound shots have actually increased. So both these sets of graphs tell you that it's not an optimum situation. Obviously, it has a lot of context to it. Maybe in many cases, it was not his fault. It was covering for somebody else's fault, where we can't hold him accountable. But it's pretty clear that in both these situations or these sets of graphs or numbers, these are not the trends that you want to see at the same time. If you want your defensive leader to really be the defensive leader that you expect him to be.
Exactly. I think just looking at the final set of graphs, I think these are the most indicative of his quote unquote stagnation or even decline that we keep seeing in the media and on social media, whatever. And there's no escaping the fact that that's true. These trends that you mentioned, they're not optimal. They're not what you want to see with a defensive linchpin of a team or any defender for that matter, especially one who has these elite aspirations like Araujo does. And there's no escaping the fact that, of course, Barcelona as a collective is struggling. So, of course, the individuals within that collective are struggling as well. But Araujo is often putting himself in those situations in the first place. So he is the one that creates the danger and then is relying on whatever his skill set is to prevent that danger from culminating and turning into something that's even worse, which is goals conceded. And you can see that in this final slide, which is errors leading to goal-bound shots. I think he makes a mistake and then Barca suffer because of it. And often he will be able to put out that fire. But sometimes, as we see in the numbers, it doesn't happen. And Barca are put in a situation that they were not supposed to be in the first place. He's much more shaky than he used to be. Maybe he's even too confident in his ability to prevent these situations. His mindset on the ball is now much more progressive, is now much more aggressive. Maybe because he knows, okay, if I mess up, I can fix it. But then you cannot fix everything.
We wanted to look into where our players are mid-season compared to how they have progressed or evolved over the last few seasons. And this is a series that we will continue. We start with Araujo. We have a large roster of players. So we will go from one profile to the other, while we also talk about the other things that are happening in this club and also some of the important games that are coming up. But I hope you all enjoyed it. Dom, any final thoughts before we close this chapter?
We've tried really hard to present a very difficult topic because analyzing defenders is such an ungrateful thing because the stats often don't bring enough context. The tactics are very difficult as well because there's so much to dissect from individual to collective. And how does it both provide context to each other? It's very difficult. With forwards and midfielders, it's slightly easier than defenders. I really hope that we've done justice to Araujo and his struggles and Barca's struggles in general. And we hope that you will enjoy the rest of the series as well.
With that, Visca, Barca, and see you on the next one.